The young woman was standing next to the crib, looking at the little girl who was already fast asleep. She couldn't stand her. She was ready to slap her right then and there. Of course, it was a figurative expression. But Sophia, especially with her head full of alcohol, was ready to do anything to get rid of that little girl. That little girl reminded her once again that her husband was married to another woman before. That little girl was the fruit of their love. She got angry every time she saw the little girl, but she had to live with little Christina. She had to put up with her pranks even if she didn't want to. Sophia wanted to have her own children. She wanted to have a son or daughter with Adrian, and for the child to be hers alone. And she cared little about what happened with Christina. She left the baby's room and headed for the kitchen. She received a text from her husband as she began to set the table. She prepared the meal, put coffee on to boil, occasionally glancing out the window. There was his car. She was a little startled. She herself did not understand why he reacted that way. She was waiting for him today to finally have a normal conversation. She had already tried several times to start this conversation, but something always stopped her. And what stopped her was simply the fear that he would leave her for setting a condition, her or the child. She had no intention of living under the same roof with her husband's child from his previous marriage. She had already tolerated the child, who had nothing to do with herself, for long enough. The man entered the apartment, took off his warm coat, and snow immediately fell from it. It had snowed so much that he barely shook it off. Even his hair was stuck with snow, although walking from the car to the entrance took only a few minutes. It was freezing cold outside. Winter was in full swing. She took off her shoes and went straight to the shower to warm up. When he came out, he got dressed again and went into the kitchen. She was no longer waiting with hot food. She sat down at the table. She didn't look happy at all. In fact, she hadn't shown a good mood for a long time. Lately, the man always seemed irritated. He had a lot of problems at work, and he often took it out on his family. Now he looked at his wife, knowing full well that she would start an unpleasant conversation that wouldn't bring him any pleasure. Adrian picked up his cup of coffee and took a sip, immediately making a face. She had forgotten to put sugar in it. She sat down opposite him, looked at him as if he himself had to guess what exactly the conversation was about. "Adrian, we are a young couple. We must live alone," the woman said, addressing her husband. She really wanted him to make a decision himself, and she really wanted him to say right now that he would take care of the child, that she was right, that she wanted to have her own children. Yes, she would agree to not have children at all as long as she was left alone with Adrian. It was fundamentally important for her to get rid of this child so as not to be constantly reminded of the deceased wife. "Well, seriously, Adrian, we need to have our own children or just live together. She is completely alien to me. Why do we need someone else's child in our house? Besides, you don't even take care of her. You have no contact with her at all. Why should I?" "Let's start with the fact that you're a woman," Adrian said calmly, but coercively. He could feel himself starting to get angry. Her behavior was getting on his nerves. It bothered him that she was once again starting this conversation. But from her facial expression, he knew she was about to continue this conversation to the end. "Why do I have to listen to all this right now? You stay home all day. I support you. All that's expected of you is to clean the house, cook, and take care of the child. That's it. Nothing else is required of you. And instead of just thanking me for working hard all the time, I have to listen to another complaint." "Yeah, well, stick with that, Adrian. What complaints are you talking about? I just want you and I to live like a family, not like people who take in a little girl that no one wants. I would understand if you loved her, if you spent time with her in some way. But it turns out that you took her in like a puppy, and I'm the one who takes care of her," Sophia said, not reaching a state of hysteria. She was trying to speak calmly, although he could sense a hysterical tone in her voice. She seemed to be on the verge of a hysterical outburst, but she still held herself back. Sophia promised herself to have a calm conversation. Previous hysterics had never worked, so she decided to try a different approach. She intensely wished that the little girl was not in that house anymore. They talked for quite a while, the conversation getting louder and louder. The little girl, who Sophia thought was sleeping, actually wasn't. She slightly opened the door and listened to the heated argument in the kitchen, which didn't seem to have an end in sight. The little girl walked over to the phone, dialed her father's sister's number, which she knew by heart. At some point, her father's sister made her memorize her phone number so that she could always call her. Sophia dialed her father's sister's number and immediately heard the ringtone. She felt her knees shaking. She was afraid that her stepmother or father would come into the room, but they continued to argue, sometimes in a more forceful tone and other times in a calmer tone. When Carolina answered the phone, Christina quickly confessed to her aunt what was happening in the apartment. Carolina listened attentively to little Christina, but at that moment she had other concerns. She assured her that she would take care of everything and not to worry. Also, Carolina asked the little girl to delete the call, just as she had taught her. Christina hung up the phone and, sure enough, deleted her call to keep it a secret. She returned to her room, still listening to her parents fighting in the kitchen. She didn't know exactly how she felt about them. She loved her mother very much, but her mother was no longer there. And all she had left was her father, who didn't seem to care, and her stepmother, who she couldn't stand. She went to her room, still listening to her parents in the kitchen. She tried to distract herself from paying attention to it. She grabbed her favorite toy, the one her mother had given her at some point, hugged it, and tried to fall asleep. Meanwhile, the argument in the kitchen continued without giving any pleasure to anyone involved. The man was getting more and more irritated. He didn't want to listen to his wife after a hard day at work. All he wanted was to eat quietly, drink coffee, sit in front of the TV, and go to sleep. He was so tired that he cared very little about what Sophia wanted to say to him, but Sophia was determined to end the conversation. "Adrian, you said you loved me. When we met, you promised me that there would be no mention of the past, but instead of keeping your promise, you simply brought this little girl home. I want you to understand that the girl is not needed here. How can you not understand? What will happen to her when she grows up? Do you know what happens to girls who live in a family where no one wants them? They get pregnant at 15. I don't want her to burden us with her own child later, because that's how it will be. She's not needed here. Do you really not have any relatives from your late wife who could take the child away?" Sophia continued, still keeping her tone controlled. Adrian was even surprised that she wasn't hysterical yet. The conversation continued for quite a while and she was still holding back. Apparently, this conversation was really important to her. "I'm her father, which means I should take care of her. But I don't have time because I'm working. You're a woman, it's your duty to take care of the children. Besides, I don't want to have any more children, so if you still want children, we won't have any more with us. You can be sure of that. You want a child? You already have one," Adrian answered rather sharply. He took his plate of food and went to the living room. He turned on the TV and started eating, deciding not to listen to his wife anymore. Sophia sat in the kitchen, covering her face with her hands. She had high hopes for that conversation. On the other hand, she also realized that nothing was going to change. Too much time had passed. She had tried to break that barrier for a long time. But now that seemed impossible to her. She looked at her husband, who only shook his head. Was her standing by the doorframe, looking into the living room, really not going to achieve anything? She herself had no answer to that question. She tidied up the kitchen, put all the food in the refrigerator, and then went to sleep. He did not want to continue this conversation, so he wrapped himself in a blanket and almost immediately fell asleep. The man sat on the couch for a long time, watching television, and went to sleep only after midnight. The conversation with his wife left an indelible mark on him. Her words kept turning around in his head in a strange way. In a sense, he agreed with her, because the child was really not wanted in that house. But he couldn't just take her and hand her over to a children's home, which meant that he would have to raise her. Several days passed after that conversation. The man left for work, kissed his wife out of habit, and went out into the street in a heavy snowfall. It was bitterly cold outside. He came back, wrapped himself up tightly in a scarf, took off his fur coat, put on a sweater, and then put his clothes back on. He went out into the street. She watched him, thinking how quickly winter came. This kind of cold usually began only in late January or mid-February. This year, such severe frosts came in December. It was really frighteningly cold. Even their balcony was covered with ice. The unusual cold for that region literally paralyzed the roads in the city. The machinery could not cope. The woman followed her husband with her eyes, worried about how he would get to work. Lately, she had been constantly thinking about what awaited her husband if something happened to his ex-wife, a car accident, and she would be left with that child. Of course, he would not keep her for long. He would simply give her to a boarding school or an orphanage. Yesterday, she and her husband agreed that he would give her up to an institution as soon as she grew up a little. Sophia was glad that the little girl would soon disappear from their apartment, but she did not want to wait those few years until Christina grew up. Sophia took out a bottle of wine and poured herself a full glass, then another. The little girl came out of her room, staggering a little. She passed Sophia, reaching for her cup of water, but she did not stay upright. Sleepily, she wobbled and hit the cup with the palm of her hand, and Sophia's favorite cup fell and shattered. Sophia did not understand why she was so angry. She grabbed the little girl. Sophia scolded and shouted at the little girl as she screamed and cried. Then she took her and locked her on the frozen balcony. The little girl was wearing only a t-shirt, and in that outfit, she was quickly trapped by the terrible frost on the balcony. What happened next is scary to imagine. Adrian spent the whole day at work, and it exhausted him emotionally, so he decided to stay a little longer. He met an old friend. They drank in a bar, danced with young girls, and only after that he headed home. He felt like he had rested a little, or rather, he had breathed out, because the tiredness had accumulated so much that he could barely see anything around him. It was as if the whole world had ceased to exist. There was only work, constant clashes with bosses, projects that had to be delivered soon, and he had no energy for them. He looked around wearily, and the snow-covered city inspired him with melancholy. In this climate, he longed to return to the time when he was married, when he worked from home, when his beloved ex-wife looked after his daughter, bringing him sandwiches while he worked at the computer. And in the evenings, they sat together, drinking coffee on the balcony, covering their legs with a blanket, while the little girl slept in the crib. Since his wife died, he stopped feeling anything for the child. He didn't even understand that she was his daughter, as if all his feelings for her had been cut off. It even seemed to him that he didn't love her just because she looked so much like his wife, his mother. The car was parked by the entrance, but he didn't dare get out. He had vague thoughts in his head. He wanted to go back in time. It physically hurt him to realize that he couldn't go back and feel happy again, as if everything he had done there had no meaning now. He loved his ex-wife so much. He was so heartbroken when she died, when he buried her, that the pain still lingered in him. He went over and over in his mind everything that had happened between them. It was truly a perfect marriage. The only thing he regretted was that he had decided to have a child, because the child did not bring them together, quite the opposite. His wife began to devote more and more time to the child, and he felt constant pangs of jealousy, but all that was in the past. Now she was gone, but there was still the daughter he wanted nothing to do with. Adrian got out of the car and headed towards his house. He entered the building, climbed the stairs to his apartment, and went inside. Returning from work, Adrian found a terrible scene. The living room was completely trashed. His drunk wife was lying on the couch. Next to her was her drunk friend, and there was no trace of the child anywhere. The balcony was wide open. Adrian ran to the balcony and saw traces of small feet and also some shoes. He was so terrified that he could not understand what was happening. Adrian grabbed Sophia by the chest, shook her, but could not get anything out of her. He closed the balcony, sat on the couch not knowing what to do next. He was scared to imagine what his wife was willing to do to get rid of the baby. He decided to do nothing until his wife recovered. He roughly grabbed her and carried her to the bathroom, literally forced her to take a cold shower. Then he gave her coffee, then took her back to the cold shower. This cycle repeated itself until she couldn't speak properly. She couldn't articulate a word. Still, she couldn't say what had happened. Then he left her alone, took her back to the living room, and left her next to her friend. Adrian was in shock at what was happening. He didn't sleep until 4 in the morning, knowing that tomorrow, or rather today, he would have to go to work. He would lie there like a sleepy fly, thinking about where his daughter was. Only until 6 in the morning Sophia could speak properly and reason. He didn't understand why he felt so bad. He was scared to imagine what they had gotten themselves into. Sophia only said that her sister had taken little Christina. Adrian stood paralyzed, not understanding what Carolina had to do with what was happening to the girl. Without asking his wife, he quickly got ready and left for work. All day long he thought about the need to visit Carolina and talk to her properly. After work, Adrian sat in the car and, despite the heavy snowfall, drove to his sister's house. He reached the residential area on the other side of the city, literally drove into the snowdrifts and parked the car in front of the familiar house. He knocked on the door, rubbing his shoulders with his hands. It was very cold. The snow was falling hard. He thought that if he delayed too long, he would not be able to get out of there. She watched the light go on in the living room, then in the hall, and suddenly her sister appeared on the threshold, a beautiful young woman with long hair that she often wore in braids. She put a thick coat over her shoulders, put on her shoes, and went down to the door. She let her brother in, and he just talked about how he wouldn't stay long, because the snow would block him. Carolina was surprised that the man only cared about the state of the car and not the state of her daughter. "Where is Christina?" "Why did you take her in the first place?" the man asked, turning to his sister. He had just been outside, deciding to pull the car into the yard. He realized he wouldn't be able to get out of there anyway and decided to stay the night. She served him a hot dinner. Suddenly, he thought that he felt much better and calmer at his sister's house than at home with his wife. She called me several days ago and told me that her stepmother was tormenting her. I promised her that I would go get her. But when I arrived, Adrian, I was simply horrified that your wife, whom I cannot even call human, had brought the child to a terrible state just because she broke a cup and then put her on the frozen balcony in just a t-shirt. When I arrived, the child was already sleeping there, covered in snow. I took her in my arms, wrapped her in my fur coat, and took her straight to the hospital. Meanwhile, your wife was drinking with her friend and did not care about what was happening around her, Carolina said, carefully restraining herself. She wanted to hit her brother for allowing that to happen to his daughter. She knew that he felt a warmer affection towards his niece than the man did towards his own daughter. He just nodded, not saying anything. A normal father would have gone to rip the head off the woman who almost killed his son. The doctor said everything went well, but they will still keep the girl under observation for a few days. She is severely hypothermic, but everything can be fixed. Honestly, I am very surprised by your calm reaction, Carolina said, carefully restraining herself. I just understand that this would have happened sooner or later. You know, we constantly argued about the girl. We even agreed to send her to a boarding school when she grew up and went to school. But it seems she decided not to wait. "We know we don't need her," Adrian said honestly, addressing his sister. Carolina was so shocked that she decided not to say anything else. She waved her hand at her brother and changed the subject. She didn't want to take the child away, so be it. She would raise the little girl herself if the biological father didn't want her. Carolina was in a similar situation when her mother got married for the second time. Her brother was already much older, and she didn't care. He was already a student, living his own life. She, on the other hand, found herself in a family where no one wanted her. Despite the 10-year age difference with her brother, Carolina was ready to raise the child on her own. If necessary, she would do anything for the little girl. She truly loved little Christina, but she loved her late mother even more, who was no longer with the girl. A long time ago, little Christina's mother rescued her, Carolina, from an abusive relationship. And Carolina will always be grateful to Christina's mother for saving her life back then. Adrian returned home the next day after work. He was distraught. Or rather, he felt like he didn't feel anything at all. He had a feeling of melancholy in his soul, maybe even apathy, either from tiredness or from the events that had occurred. He had a hard time recognizing his own feelings. He looked at his wife and realized that she was worried about his condition. She snuggled up to his chest, and he held her tightly. They stood like that in the hallway, hugging each other. "Adrian, I love you so much. I don't want you to take her away," the woman confessed sincerely, addressing her husband. He nodded at her, gave her a kiss on the head. This night was truly perfect for them. They had dinner together, had a romantic conversation, watched TV together wrapped in a blanket, talked a lot, and before going to sleep, they gave themselves over to love. While she slept, Adrian lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He took out a cigarette and lit it. He knew that when she was asleep, she wouldn't wake up from the smell. Only in the morning, when she opened her eyes, would she wrinkle her nose sweetly and tell him not to smoke in the bedroom anymore. But he would continue to smoke in the bedroom. He took a last drag on the cigarette, still staring at the reflective ceiling where only the glow at the end of the cigarette was visible. He thought about what to do next. He really didn't want to take his daughter away from his sister. He even considered paying money just for her to keep the child. At that moment, his daughter was in the hospital, and he had no feelings for her. He didn't care about her or feel distressed. Moreover, he didn't even want to talk about her. His wife was right. The child was simply interrupting his happy life, as if she was the cause of all his fights and disagreements. He still didn't imagine how difficult his life would be with this woman, but he thought he would be better off without his daughter anyway. He put out his cigarette, hugged his wife, and sank into sleep. Carolina was standing at the entrance of the hospital, swaying from foot to foot. There were piles of snow everywhere, and she couldn't warm herself. She didn't want to go into the hospital because she couldn't stand hospitals. Then she saw her niece approaching her through the glass doors, and only then did she enter the place, signed the necessary papers, picked up the little girl in her arms, and carried her to the car. The little girl clung tightly to her aunt, resting her head on her shoulder. She felt at peace and safe when she was near her aunt, instead of her stepmother. She thought that her aunt would take her to her parents and immediately started crying when they got into the car. Carolina did not need to explain anything. She understood why the little girl was crying. "Don't worry, Christina. We won't go to your stepmother and father's. I don't want to lie to you, but they decided not to take you. You know, you're too young to understand. But I was in your place too when my parents didn't care. I didn't have an aunt who could take me, so I decided that I would take you myself. Now we'll go together, we'll sort out some papers, and soon I'll legalize custody over you. So we'll be living together," she said with a smile. And her heart warmed when she saw that Christina looked happy upon hearing that news. Carolina was afraid to imagine in what conditions the little girl lived there if she was so happy. It took several long weeks before Carolina was able to complete the paperwork. Her brother happily handed over custody and even started sending money regularly. They officially settled on child support, and he paid it punctually. He was ready to pay any amount just to keep the child from being taken away. He was still ashamed of having abandoned his daughter, but he had no feelings for her and did not want to take her away. And as soon as the child disappeared from the apartment, his relationship with his wife became simply perfect. After half a year, little Christina began to call Carolina Mom, and Carolina also considered her her own daughter. They lived together, building their life together. At first, of course, it was a bit difficult for them because the girl did not know the basic rules. She did not know how to dress herself, read, and had basic household skills. But the girl learned everything quickly and easily adapted if Carolina helped her. Very soon, Christina became much more independent. She enjoyed going to the kindergarten where Carolina picked her up. They lived together like soulmates, although sometimes there were disagreements. But Carolina saw all these difficulties in a positive light. After all, she was once a child too, and understood that broken cups were just the result of clumsiness. She had been like that in her childhood too. She loved the child very much. She tried hard not to think about the fact that this little girl turned out to be unwanted by anyone after her mother's death. And in fact, it no longer mattered what had happened in the past. The important thing was that now the child was safe. She was happy.